Hi, welcome to the Bio-181 Tutoring Center videos. The topic of today's video is sexual selection. So we've been talking about I've been talking about natural selection and in a lot of other videos as it relates to evolution, and so now we're going to get into a specific type of selection. And so sexual selection has to do with certain traits or characteristics that organisms possess that make them more likely to obtain mates. So whereas other characteristics in natural selection just make the organism more likely to survive and obtain food so it can survive and overcome predators so it can survive, so that it can reproduce, this is actually dealing right with obtaining mates so that it can reproduce. And so something important that we need to know for sexual selection is sexual dimorphism, and this is defined as differences, marked differences between two sexes in secondary characteristics. And secondary characteristics are just characteristics that don't have to do with reproduction, because obviously two different sexes will have different reproductive systems, but this goes farther than that, and it's other things that are different. And we see this even just with us humans. There's clearly other differences in behavior and other things between males and females besides our reproductive systems. And so this kind of leads to the two main types of sexual selection. They're intra and inter, and it can be really easy to confuse these two and mix them up. And so I've been trying to think of some good acronyms or ways to memorize them, so hopefully mine will help you today. So first is intra selection. And it has to do with selection within the same sex. So you have two members of the same sex that are going to be competing for mates, and we often see this in males. I think it's you have those two that are competing with their antlers, and they're fighting each other, and the one that is bigger and stronger and can fight off the other is the one that will get the mate. And so I guess one way to remember this is the intra, the one with the A. Think alpha, so which is the alpha male maybe or alpha female who's going to obtain that mate. Interselection, on the other hand, has to do with selection between the sexes, with one individual of one sex being choosy on their mate of the other sex. And so this is sometimes called mate choice. And we commonly see this with females choosing something of the male, but it can go the other way around, and it can go the other way around with intra as well. And so a really common example is peacocks. Most of us know that a male peacock is the one with all the bright plumage that we commonly associate with peacock, whereas female peacocks actually tend to be quite dull in their colors and don't have all those plumes. And so what is happening is the male is trying to attract the female with all of these plumes. So a male that has a trait that makes it more attractive to the females is going to have an advantage and be sexually selected for. So maybe one way to remember this is the E could be something like impress me, even though impress doesn't start with E, but it kind of sounds the same. So impress me, make me want to choose you. Something interesting to note though is a lot of times when we're talking about mate choice, it has to do with how something looks or some ritual that it's giving off to the female. And this presents this kind of conflict between the benefits and the dangers, because having that bright plumage of the peacock or whatever it's doing to attract the female makes it attract the female and more likely to have offspring, but at the same time it's attracting predators, and it's more likely to be killed off by a predator and thus not pass on its genes to offspring. So it's kind of a balance of which is stronger. Is attracting mates more prominent to have those bright colors, or is it more beneficial to not actually have those bright colors so you can actually survive? And so then the question is kind of why are these different outward appearances attractive to these individuals of the one sex that are choosing? Why are they choosing individuals that look like that? And there's actually been a lot of research that's shown that how an organism looks can correlate with its good genes. And I actually watched a really interesting video on this a while back, and they were doing a lot of experiments about what humans find attractive, males or females find attractive in each other, and those characteristics or traits actually correspond with good genes, or things that will be beneficial and more likely for the offspring to survive. and the individual to survive. And it also can maybe be beneficial to producing the best offspring. So there's actually a study done where they had a bunch of males wear just a plain white t-shirt for a couple days so that their scent was left on the t-shirt. And then they had females smell these t-shirts and indicate which t-shirt they were, or like smell they were most attracted to. And then they did research with they looked at the immune systems of all the individuals, and they found this general trend that individuals that had very different immune systems tended to be more attracted to each other than individuals with more similar immune systems. And this is really fascinating because it indicates that if those two, because they're more likely to be attracted to each other, they would have an offspring that would be more likely to survive. So that's not necessarily intersexual selection, but that's just a maybe potential application of sexual selection. So that's all for sexual selection. Now we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit into preservation of genetic variation. So we have natural selection going on, and it's choosing certain traits. And so some may ask, well, why do we still have some of these unadvantageous or unbeneficial traits or alleles or genes in the population if they're not an advantage? Why aren't they all gone? That would be bad though, because then we would lose some genetic variation if that gene was completely wiped out of the population, because it's not an advantage, because something could change in the environment that then would make that gene advantageous, and if it's gone, then it could cause problems. So how do we retain this genetic variation? How do we not completely wipe out all the unbeneficial alleles? And the first thing is diploidy. So remember, the majority of organisms that we're looking at are eukaryotic, and it's thus they are diploid organisms. So the mother and father will mate, and they have organisms with two alleles, and you have dominant and recessive, and that was the whole genetics unit. And so a lot of times we have these unbeneficial alleles that are actually hidden in the recessive, because the dominant is being portrayed and is beneficial, but there's still a carrier of the recessive. And so that allows us to maintain some of that genetic variation, because there's still a 1 in 4 chance if two heterozygous individuals mate to produce an individual with that unadvantageous trait, which can then, if the environment changes and becomes beneficial, can then slowly arise in the population. The other thing is balance and selection, and that just has to do with the intermediate genotype or phenotype becoming more prevalent. So that kind of has a lot to do with heterozygous, and so we are balancing out the different phenotypes, and so we apply that in two different ways, with heterozygous advantage and frequency dependent selection. So heterozygous advantage is something you're definitely going to want to know about. It is when the intermediate or the heterozygous individual has some advantage over the homozygous individuals. And so we see an example of this with sickle cell disease and malaria in Africa. So sickle cell disease is due to a recessive trait, so you have to have both recessive alleles to have it. However, there are a lot of carriers in Africa of sickle cell disease. A lot of people are heterozygous for this. And that is because being heterozygous or a carrier of the sickle cell trait actually makes you more likely to not have the effects of malaria or not die from malaria. And so as a result, being heterozygous is actually an advantage. And so that's why sickle cell disease is still kind of prominent in Africa, is because a lot of the population are carriers, and so there's still a 1 in 4 chance of them mating and having children with actual sickle cell disease. But as a result, a lot of people can now be more resistant to malaria. The other one is frequency-dependent selection, and that has to do with certain traits are only advantageous when they are in the minority. So it's kind of like you only have a higher chance of survival when you're alone, because you're like special, and so that trait is an advantage when you're alone. And so we'll see a lot of times two different traits kind of fluctuating back and forth. And an example in the book was you have these fish with right and left mouth ways in which they would attack a predator. So it was more advantageous to be right mouth when you're kind of in the minority, but then as more of the right mouth individuals became prominent because of natural selection, then it became more advantage to be left mouth, and so it just fluctuates back and forth depending on the frequency of the allele. And the last one is neutral variation. A lot of the variations in us aren't beneficial or detrimental, so they're not really going to be acted on a whole bunch, and so that preserves genetic variation, because if the environment changes, then maybe one of them will become beneficial or detrimental. So maybe an example is you have a population of organisms that have fur color, and their fur color is varied in the population, and it's not beneficial or detrimental to have one fur color. All of them are about equal in their likelihood and relative fitness with their fur colors. And something in the environment changes, and now there's a new predator that's been introduced. And so now the individuals need to be able to hide from the predator, and so individuals that have a color of a coat that is more likely to help them hide, maybe that allele will become more frequent. And so that's maybe an example of how a lot of our alleles, they aren't being really acted on by natural selection because there's no disadvantage or advantage to having them. That is all for today. I hope you have a better understanding of sexual selection and the ways that we preserve genetic variation in populations. Keep working on this stuff, and thank you for watching.